Welcome to today's explainer. So, have you ever caught yourself wondering why we sometimes desperately miss the very people who gave us basically nothing but uncertainty and tiny little fragments of affection, right? It's this deeply universal yet kind of unspoken emotional paradox. So today, we're going to completely deconstruct exactly why we hold on so tightly to people who could never love us properly. I want you to sit with this thought for a second. There are people we remember more beautifully than they ever treated us. It's wild, but the people who disappointed us, the ones who just vanished when we needed clarity the most, they somehow loom so much larger in our memories than the folks who actually stayed and treated us right. The strange, almost backwards reality is that sometimes the less they actually gave us, the more intensely we seem to remember them. And that leaves us staring at the ultimate question: why? Why on earth do we romanticize people who literally couldn't love us? Well, the core thesis we're diving into today proposes something incredibly fascinating. It suggests that, actually, we were never just in love with who they were. Rather, we were in love with everything they left unfinished. Let's get into part one. The unfinished story, the mind's aversion to ambiguity. Our minds have this fundamental, hardwired aversion to ambiguity. I mean, think about it. A relationship that ends cleanly, with a real conversation and solid closure, that eventually just settles down and becomes a normal memory. But a relationship packed with an ambiguous ending, ooh, that remains a burning obsession. There's actually a concept in psychology called the Zeigarnik effect. It basically says we remember interrupted or incomplete tasks way better than completed ones. And because reality never gave us that satisfying conclusion, our imagination just hijacks the wheel and starts writing one for us. Your memory essentially becomes this rogue film editor. We look back and we quietly just erase the weeks when they barely even tried. We cut out the ordinary, day-to-day disappointment, and we keep only those beautiful, tender, cinematic scenes. We start torturing ourselves with the what-ifs. What if the timing had been different? What if we'd met 5 years later? Through these little mental edits, the person stops being a flawed human and magically turns into a flawless possibility. And let me tell you, it's almost impossible for reality to compete with a possibility. Moving right along to section 2, the illusion of potential, coping with limitations. Okay, let's dive into this. Because to cope with a person's actual limitations, our brains do something remarkably clever but quietly super dangerous. We subconsciously split them in two. We take the real person, the one who forgot to call, the one who totally avoided difficult conversations and just handed you pure uncertainty, and we contrast them right up against an imagined person. We tell ourselves things like, oh, this imagined version is just afraid of intimacy, or they've been hurt before, or they secretly feel something enormous but just don't know how to express it. And hey, those explanations might even be true. Human beings are incredibly complicated. But here is the massive danger. Understanding someone's limitations can really quickly morph into a convenient way of excusing them. We become so utterly fascinated by why they can't love us that we completely stop asking if they are actually loving us in the first place. Which brings us to number 3, uncertainty versus intensity, misinterpreting unpredictability. Get ready for a bit of a reality check here. When affection arrives completely inconsistently, like when one day they make you feel like the most chosen person on earth, and the very next day they are freezing cold, we get trapped in this agonizing cycle of waiting. Suddenly, a totally mundane text message feels like a major life event. A basic compliment becomes hard evidence of their undying love. A couple hours of closeness ends up having to sustain us through weeks of empty hope. What we so often label as chemistry or passion in these toxic dynamics is, well, it's actually just a trauma response. Sometimes what feels like this extraordinary, overwhelming love is quite literally just the extraordinary amount of attention your brain requires to survive the sheer, panic-inducing uncertainty of the situation. Emotional intensity and emotional safety, yeah, they are absolutely not the same thing. Because of this intense cycle, we end up falling head over heels for potential. We rationalize it to ourselves. We say, it's going to work out when they're finally ready, or just when life gets a little less complicated, or when they finally allow themselves to be vulnerable. What we're doing here is stripping away every single flaw. We're no longer in a relationship with the actual person standing right in front of us. We're in a relationship with a future, heavily idealized, totally made-up version of them. And honestly, that is exactly why leaving is so incredibly painful. We aren't just grieving what actually happened, we are actively grieving the trips we imagined taking and the deep conversations we just knew we'd eventually have. Let's look inward for part 4, the mirror of the past. What are we trying to prove? There's another, much deeper reason why emotionally unavailable people become so insanely compelling to us. Deep down in our guts, fighting for their sparse affection, often feels like a way to prove our own worth and value. I really want you to take this core truth to heart right now. Love should not require us to win a trial. The twisted logic we fall into goes something like this. If I can get this impossibly closed off person to finally love me, well, that proves I'm special and I'm worth the effort. But listen to me. Being chosen by someone who is emotionally unavailable does not magically increase your value as a human being. And being rejected by them certainly doesn't reduce it. When affection becomes this prize that you constantly have to earn and work for, that isn't actual love. That's a pursuit. And often, when we finally look back, we realize something pretty startling. Sometimes you aren't actually missing that specific person at all. Really ask yourself, who were you around them? Were you younger? Was a brand new chapter in your life just kicking off? Did they happen to enter your life during a really vivid, colorful season? Sometimes remembering them is simply a vehicle for returning to a lost version of yourself. You're actually just grieving the atmosphere of a lost world, a past summer, a time when you genuinely still believed certain things were possible. Nostalgia has this incredibly sneaky way of making highly unsuitable people feel almost sacred. Moving to number 5, protecting the fantasy, the peculiar advantage of distance. So, because this person was never fully, genuinely available, the relationship remained entirely cinematic. Think about it. Distance perfectly protects our fantasy. Your imagination never had to face the boring, mundane realities of an actual life together. I'm talking about paying the bills, doing the grocery shopping, dealing with illness, or just the utter boredom of a random Tuesday morning. It was never truly tested by ordinary reality. So to strip all that romantic poetry away from our memories and finally face the truth, we have to ask ourselves a very piercing question. Not, how strongly did I feel? Because, hey, your feelings were likely very, very real. Instead, you have to look in the mirror and ask, what did I actually receive? Now, what's really interesting about this breakdown is how starkly the beauty of our imagination contrasts with the bare bones reality of what they actually provided. Look at this. You imagined endless potential, right? But did they actually provide consistency? You imagined this incredible mind-reading connection, but did you even receive basic honesty? You felt intense passion, for sure, but did you actually have any emotional safety? Your memory literally has to surrender its poetry when it's faced with this kind of truth. The connection and the tenderness, sure, they may have existed, but both of these things can be true at once. It was entirely real to you, and it still was not enough. Section 6, the resolution. You don't have to make them a villain. Here is the profound relief in all of this. Letting go doesn't mean you have to turn the other person into some terrible monster. Sometimes nobody was evil. Sometimes a person is just frightened, or they're emotionally immature, or honestly, maybe the timing really was just terrible. They simply could not meet you where you needed to be met. Moving on just requires a deeply adult realization. It's being able to say, I understand why you could not love me properly, and I also understand why I cannot keep building a life around that. Compassion doesn't require giving someone continued access to your life. Understanding someone's trauma or their limitations is entirely different from actually being compatible with them in a healthy, functioning relationship. And finally, part 7, the real grief, releasing the meaning. The absolute hardest thing to let go of in these situations is rarely the actual flesh and blood person. Nope. The hardest thing to release is the meaning that we assign to them. We told ourselves this grand story that they were our ultimate destiny, that they were the one who would make all the painful waiting worthwhile, the ultimate proof that we were finally lovable. And when we let them go, we have to grieve and release that entire story too. But as we wrap this up, we can actually reframe this whole experience. Maybe they weren't your great, tragic lost love. Maybe they were just a profound lesson. They taught us what we should absolutely no longer mistake for love. They showed us the vast, totally unbridgeable difference between intense, agonizing longing and actual quiet intimacy. The difference between just imagining a future and actually having a real partner to build one with. You can completely miss someone without ever returning to them. You can understand them deeply without putting your life on hold, waiting for them. You can treasure what a connection meant without pretending for a second that it was what you actually needed. The love that takes up the absolute most space in your imagination isn't always the love that's going to make you happiest in reality. So as we close out today's explainer, I want to leave you with one final thought to chew on. Who are you still holding on to, not because of what they actually gave you, but because of the story you are just too afraid to let go of?